was a mutant.
Hello and welcome. I'm your host, Will. Hey there, true believers. We all know that Jean Grey is a powerful psychic, usually on a cosmic level. But does that translate well to her appearance in Spider-Man Brand New Day? Well, we're gonna discuss that in today's video. Let's get to it, shall we?
I didn't know you could get that big.
I am a firm believer in the fact that sometimes a villain is more important than the hero in a film, because without a great villain, how heroic can a hero be? However, I think it's fair to say that Spider-Man Brand New Day doesn't suffer from this problem, as it gives us one of the most unexpected villains in the MCU, the telepath, Jean Grey. With mutants becoming increasingly prominent in the Marvel Cinematic Universe, most people, including me, had assumed her first appearance would be slightly more heroic in nature. But I guess Feige and co had other plans, and boy, it works. In my opinion, Sadie Sink delivers one of the best portrayals of Jean Grey's character that I have ever watched, as she perfectly embodies the troubled young girl with a traumatic past that has led her down a very dark road. She doesn't just turn evil because she gets possessed by a cosmic entity. Here, her villainy stems from deeply rooted trauma based on loss and discrimination. I know Spider-Man Brand New Day is far from a perfect movie, but I have to give credit where credit is due, because Jean makes for a terrifying villain. As always, this video will contain massive spoilers for the film, so consider yourself warned. With that out of the way, join me as I explore the anatomy of Marvel's mystery villain, Jean Grey, in Spider-Man Brand New Day. Let's begin. Who is this mystery villain really? In my opinion, one of the coolest things to have come out of the MCU recently has been the build-up and introduction of the villain in Spider-Man Brand New Day, Jean Grey. For years, the members of the X-Men have been depicted as a group who will fight the good fight and save the very people who hate and misunderstand them. In other words, these guys are the ultimate good guys. However, I think it's fair to say that what Marvel does with Jean's character in Brand New Day totally subverts decades of tradition. Jean is not depicted as the voice of reason and the heart of the X-Men. Instead, she is shown as this terrifying and disembodied force of nature. Yeah, I know she's been portrayed as an antagonist before, but trust me, this movie blows every one of those depictions out of the water. In the first act of the film, Sadie Sink's character enters the story as an unnamed, unseen terror who is capable of possessing human bodies like some sort of demon or spirit. I, for one, didn't know that Jean was capable of telepathy of that nature, where she is literally able to inhabit the bodies of others. It gives the entire first act of the film an ominous tone, like Spidey is fighting against a foe who might not even be from this earth. Honestly, with Marvel introducing the likes of Mephisto and Ghost Rider recently, my mind was already drifting towards a supernatural conclusion. I think the folks at Marvel handled the introduction of this mystery villain brilliantly, starting all the way from Sadie Sink's casting as Jean Grey, which had been kept under wraps for so long. I think this has to be one of the dopest ways to introduce not just a villain, but also one of the biggest characters in the next phase of the MCU involving mutants. How does jumping into a body actually work? Remember how I mentioned her ability to inhabit other people's bodies earlier? Well, trust me, it's as terrifying as it sounds. Normally, Jean is depicted in most films and comics as being an exceptional telepath with telekinetic powers. However, this movie gives her the power to literally dominate people's minds on a massive scale. Not long after the movie kicks off, we get to see this insidious power in action as Jean uses it to hop from one body to the next while trying to distract Spider-Man after she steals a tank and rams it into a building. I bet I wasn't the only one confused when we saw her pulling out her body-swapping shenanigans at the start. Because forget knowing about the limits of her powers, I think it's fair to say that most people didn't even know what was going on or who was responsible for it. However, Spidey figures out that this body-swapping ability of hers actually has a finite range of 30 feet, which he uses to prevent her from jumping to another body by trapping the inhabited body of a pilot in midair. I know a lot of this might just be going over your head right now. That's because I'm trying to keep it as spoiler-free as possible. So when you watch the film, all of this will make sense to you. Later on, during a flashback scene, this 30-foot limit is confirmed when we watch Jean's sister Sarah teach her about hopping into different bodies. Additionally, we learn that if Jean wishes to inhabit a body that is outside her power's range, she can jump to the nearest body and then create a chain by jumping to the next one until she reaches her originally intended target. What this means is that the 30-foot radius extends not just from her original body, but also from the body she is currently possessing. Later in the film, this range increases exponentially, along with her control over her targets, all of which I will explain as this video goes along, so be sure to keep watching. Why can't she take over Spider-Man? I don't think the movie explicitly explains why she isn't able to take over Spider-Man's body, but I believe it's fairly obvious why this is the case if you look at what Peter is going through at that point in the film. Stepping into spoiler territory once again, I think it's obvious from the start of the film that Tom Holland's character is still reeling from the incident in the previous movie, in which everyone he knows forgets him. I think it's easy to forget that Spider-Man is still a young guy who has gone through a lot in his life at such an early age, from losing everyone he loved and cared about to death or memory loss. He's just a lonely guy trying to drown out his sorrows through crime fighting. I believe that, in the film, this has led to him suppressing the Peter Parker within him and letting the spider in him grow stronger, which explains his heightened senses, violent impulses, and organic webbing. From an early point in the film, I think it's safe to say that Spider-Man is more spider than man, especially at the moment when Jean tries to probe his mind. Her ability is thrown off because she had expected to encounter a normal human mind. I can't really think of any other reason why someone as powerful as Jean is otherwise unable to penetrate his mind. She continuously refers to Spider-Man as having a monster inside him, and this is precisely why she can't control him. In fact, I feel like it's the same reason she cannot fully control the Hulk either, because within the Hulk, there is also Banner's personality, meaning there's more than one consciousness she has to subdue. This leads to her messing things up, resulting in the Savage Hulk being unleashed on Spider-Man. I think there's also the simple fact that she is nowhere near as powerful during that part of the film as she becomes at the end. What happened to her sister Sarah? What happens to Jean's sister Sarah, I feel, is the anchor that grounds her personality and motivations, as we learn later in the film. Remember how I said it was Sarah who taught her how to use her abilities to jump into bodies? Well, we also find out that the sisters had been abandoned by their parents after it became evident that the two possessed powers. Having the same powers as her, Jean constantly looked up to her sister, who had acted as both a sibling and a parent to her, which I feel makes it clear why Jean is so attached to her. However, when Sarah is kidnapped in broad daylight by the nefarious group called Damage Control, Jean's sheltered life is turned upside down. Following this, she dedicates her life to finding out what happened to her sister, leading her down the road to attacking the group that everyone still thinks consists of the good guys at that point in the story. However, after she is captured by Damage Control with Spider-Man's help, Jean is subjected to the same questionable experiments that her sister was put through. During the course of her torture session, it's revealed that Sarah had succumbed to the heinous experiments that Damage Control had put her through in an attempt to control her powers. What does grief do to her power? The rage that arises when she hears that her sister was killed by these people from Damage Control is something to behold, as she lashes out to control not just the individuals involved, but also several innocent people. I feel like this is the moment when we get to see a version of Jean Grey that is closest to her comic book counterpart in terms of the scale of her powers and abilities. I believe that before she discovered her loss, no matter how extreme the measures she took, Jean operated under a subconscious level of emotional restraint. This restraint is shattered by the emotional trauma, which leads to her channeling her anger into raw psionic power, finally transforming her into a real powerhouse. Jean is no longer bound by her 30-foot power range. Instead, we see her powers extend across Manhattan, making thousands of people instantly freeze in place. As if that weren't enough of a feat by itself, Jean then puppeteers an entire squad of hand ninjas against Spider-Man. I need you to understand that she wasn't just throwing them at him. The way she was maneuvering them tactically, as if they were really fighting as a group, speaks volumes about the degree of control she had over her powers. Let's not forget the fact that she is doing all of this while simultaneously freezing thousands of individuals in place across the city. However, that's not the end of how crazy her power levels become due to her potential being unlocked by the grief of her sister's death. When Spider-Man is critically shot, Jean displays extraordinary power by using precise and localized telekinesis on his internal organs to stabilize them, preventing him from dying. For her to have pulled off this feat, she would probably have had to hold his internal tissue together to prevent internal hemorrhaging. What this shows, in my opinion, is that not only is she able to use her powers at a macro level to control massive crowds, but also at a micro level to do the things I just mentioned. More importantly, I think it shows her transition from a destroyer to eventually becoming a life giver, which is an insane amount of character development for her. I think it's lovely to see how her grief grants her the power to eventually heal from it. How does Spider-Man finally stop her? In the second half of the film, due to his growing arachnid powers making him lose control, Peter consults Bruce Banner about developing a device to dampen the mutations. since Banner himself had been using such a device to suppress his Hulk persona. Being the genius that he is, Peter then develops a version of the device that will work universally, intending to use it on Jean to suppress her powers without harming or killing her. I think it's so in character for Peter to develop a way to tackle an enemy without permanently harming them, which shouldn't really be a surprise, considering that he tried to do the same thing for the likes of Doc Ock and the Green Goblin in the previous film. Thanks to the inhibitor, Damage Control manages to capture Jean, leading to the big revelation that she really isn't as much of a villain as the audience thought she was. Following this, as I said earlier, Jean goes on a total rampage, controlling the members of the Hand alongside thousands of people in Manhattan, hell-bent on avenging her sister's death. Now, I need you to understand that this version of Jean is far too powerful, I feel, for something like an inhibitor to suppress. There's also the fact that it's already quite evident at this point in the story that she really isn't the true villain, so Spider-Man doesn't need to resort to any sort of conflict to stop her. Remember how I discussed earlier that she couldn't penetrate Peter's mind in the beginning? Well, this time he willingly lets her into his head, where she sees that he is just like her, a young, kindred spirit who has lost everyone close to him. In his head, Jean sees a vision of Aunt May consoling Peter after he receives his power and finds herself in his shoes. This heals something inside her, even as Peter takes a bullet for her, finally restoring her humanity and bringing her back to the path of goodness from which she had strayed because of her trauma. In the end, this is how Spider-Man stops her, not with gadgets or fists, but by allowing her to peek into his soul. What's still unconfirmed about her future? In the end, after holding Peter together long enough for him to heal and survive the bullet he took for her, we learn from Frank Castle that Jean has moved on. We're not told where she's headed, but I think it's clear that wherever she's going, the hatred within her heart has been healed thanks to Peter's efforts. You have to understand that everything in this section is going to be purely speculative, because, I believe, Marvel has now revealed what it's going to do with Sadie Sink's character in future projects. What we do know is that mutants are going to continue appearing in the MCU, and Jean's appearance seems to be heralding that very thing. In all likelihood, she is eventually going to become one of the founding members of the MCU's X-Men, just as her comic book counterpart was. I just hope they don't go down the Jean Grey Phoenix Ford route once again, which, in my opinion, they have failed to do justice to time and time again. We still have to find out what the whole VMAX message involves, and I think it's likely that they will use her character to explore that plot point in the future. On a more personal note, let me ask this. Am I the only one shipping Peter with Jean? I kinda hope Marvel goes down that route, though it will probably never happen, but hey, I'm allowed to dream, aren't I? Well, whatever the future holds for Jean Grey, it certainly looks bright, as she has finally come to terms with her trauma and abandoned her path of vengeance. In the end, I think it's fair to say that this was one of the most unique introductions of a character in any Marvel movie. I believe we can also see how Marvel is going to handle the X-Men, judging by how traumatic they made her character's story feel. I, for one, cannot wait for the rest of the X-Men to make their appearances in the MCU, and if how they portray Jean is anything to go by, I believe we're in for one hell of a ride. Tell me, what did you think about how they handled Jean Grey's character in Brand New Day? I'd love to know in the comments. For now though, it's time for me to say goodbye. I hope to see you in the next one.